Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a book that I read, one that I read for the book club that I'm in with my friend Bevan. This is kind of a Bevan recommended read, but I'm really saving that fun graphic I made for the books that are like on our Google Drive. So not necessarily this one. This book is about Palestinian Americans and sexism and misogyny in Arab culture. I am referring to A Woman Is No Man by Etaf Rum, which was published in 2019. For those who don't know, Etaf Rum is a Palestinian American writer. She has a master's degree in writing and whatnot, and she has only published one thing in her writing career, and that is this book, which I find to be very interesting. This is her first debut novel, and it kind of shows. I'll talk a little bit about that more in the analysis section. But yeah, this is the first book that she's written, and I would kind of like to see more from her in the future, especially if this is her starting point. She only stands to get better from here, hopefully. I haven't found that with other writers, unfortunately. And she's really based her writings, and especially in this story, based on part of her own life. And that's pretty much all I know about her. So without further ado, let's talk about A Woman Is No Man. I will do a summary, a little bit of an analysis, and we will move on from there. So A Woman Is No Man focuses on a couple of characters. It shifts perspective over the course of the story. It focuses on Isra, Deya, Fareeda, who is Isra's mother-in-law, and a little bit on Sarah, although she is not the primary focus of this story. So it begins by focusing on Isra. She is a Palestinian Muslim woman living in Palestine in 1990. She is getting ready for an arranged marriage. She's been meeting with a number of suitors that her family has lined up. And she's managed to find someone that she wants to marry, a man named Adam, who is actually from America. And so she is going to be moving to America with him. She's a bit sad because she'll miss her mom, and her mother is a bit sad too, which I think is her understanding that maybe Isra isn't ready to leave the house or to be in another country away from her support system. The story then flashes forward to 2008, where it focuses on Deya and also Fareeda. So Deya is Isra's daughter. She is getting ready to go into an arranged marriage herself. She's meeting with a number of potential suitors, although she is a bit hesitant to engage in the process at all because, she's wondering, is this all that's expected of me in life? Am I going to have all this responsibility and, I'm not going to be able to be fulfilled any other way. Also, Isra is missing from her life, which we find out the reason for why later there. So Deya is sort of bucking tradition at this point. And in the past, we learned that Isra has felt alone. Adam is a bit distant from her. He has to work a lot, and she's not really getting much help from Fareeda or her father-in-law. They seem to be enforcing a lot of responsibilities upon her, and she has no one else to turn to, except for Sarah, who is Fareeda's daughter, and they managed to bond a little bit and connect over books, which makes Isra feel a lot better. But Isra gets pregnant, and it turns out to be a girl, Deya, and Isra is happy, but the rest of the family is upset because girls are seen as a burden, whereas boys are ideal because they can carry on the family's legacy. In the present, Deya sees a mysterious stranger approach the house and leave a note, and when Deya goes to the address that was provided on the note, she runs into Sarah, who had long ago run away from the family. And Sarah notes that it's possible for Deya to not fall into the cycle of an arranged marriage and all that brings, because she has a choice. Whereas Sarah ran away from home, she encourages Deya not to do that because she can stand firm in her decision not to get married right away, and it's possible that confronting all of this will make Fareeda and the others understand. Back in the past, Isra has another girl, and then a third child after that, all girls. Adam is upset. He begins abusing Isra, but she makes sure that it doesn't happen in front of her daughters, and Fareeda knows about it as well, but she encourages Isra to wear makeup because a woman's shame should not be known. And Isra also notes that Adam has begun drinking a lot more, possibly because there's a lot of responsibility placed on him as the oldest male child in the family. Young Sarah begins to be defiant at this time, including saying that she'd rather go to college or do something else because the men have the opportunity and she does not. And around this time, Fareeda begins slapping and abusing, kind of beating Sarah to beat the defiance out of her. But Sarah, again, she introduces Isra to books, and Isra develops a sense of self-love. Even though she couldn't get Adam to love her, she feels love for herself and is enjoying the books that she's reading in the process. In the present, Deya meets with a suitor named Nasser, and they seem to have a little bit in common, and he seems to be quite progressive, but ultimately a rift grows between them because he still expects her to raise the children. Even if she does go to college, he believes that it's the woman's responsibility to do all that sort of work. Also in the past, we learned that Fareeda had a couple daughters, but she murdered them in the 1970s because of the pressure to have a male child, mixed with the fact that she couldn't keep getting pregnant and having all these kids at once, because that would be a lot of overwork for her, a lot of stress. And she comes to believe that a jinn is haunting the family as a result. Also in the 90s, Isra has a fourth daughter, and she, in fact, gets pregnant again after that. But she does a self-abortion where she just keeps jumping down the stairs and hitting her stomach. And that works, but that also terrifies Fareeda because, again, she believes that there's a jinn haunting the family, but no one else finds out what Isra is doing. And then in the present, we learned that Isra was actually murdered by Adam because she had intended to leave the family, and then he committed suicide, and that brought shame to the family and the reputation. And Deya forces everyone to confront this, and in doing so actually helps heal the entire family. And she ends up getting into New York University with the blessing of Fareeda and her family in the process, because they understand that this cycle led to the deaths of those they loved, and ultimately all they were focused on was their shame and reputation rather than what this cycle is doing to their family. And as the story ends, it flashes back to Isra preparing to leave with her daughters, indicating that there's some hope because she's getting ready to board a train and leave the area to be away with Adam. Although given what we know what happens to Isra, this ending isn't as optimistic or hopeful as I think Rum wanted you to believe it was. In terms of analysis, there is plenty to consider in this book. I would say it's a pretty good book, but there are a few issues here and there that Rum kind of falls into, maybe because it's a tricky area, or she had a message but without like a clear plot to follow. It could have been that. But one of the things she writes about is gender, sexism, and misogyny, all strongly connected in some way in this story. Like this, it's basically the entire outer shell of this story of what connects everything together. And the story is presented through the lens of Arab and Muslim culture. In order to understand the story, you have to understand both that religion and that culture, how it's a patriarchal society. Men are often dominant, especially in Palestine. Palestine and various Arab cultures, and women are subservient. They seem to serve the men, and they're often regarded as just like they have to raise the children, they have to wear hijabs, they can't go out alone. If they do anything like disrespectful, that's seen as bringing shame to the family. Although this is contrasted with like the Muslim religion, where women are often praised and put on a pedestal. And so it's like the difference between that is where these women fall to in this story. Where like Arab cultures, like only men can do great things, and there are excuses for men. But in the Muslim religion, like women are praised pretty highly. But in that in between space, there's the women who are, not given a sense of equality, not allowed to do many of the things that the men are doing. Women are essentially seen as less than. And there's a good quote that I would like to read to you. Actually, a couple good quotes here. "You are too young to understand this now," Mama said, "but you must always remember," she lifted Isra's chin, "there is nothing out there for a woman but her bait wa dar, her house and home. Marriage, motherhood, that is a woman's only worth." And that is what Isra's mother says to her at the start of the story, that all she has is her house and her home. She can't have anything else because a woman's only place is in the home, taking care of the children, cleaning, cooking, doing that kind of stuff. And like a woman can expect nothing else beyond that, which is an unfortunate thing, but is true in Arabic society, but also in many other societies as well. There's another interesting quote that I would like to read to you from this. "Because marriage is what's important for girls," Fareeda snapped, "not college. You're almost a teenager. It's time you grew up and learned this now. A woman is not a man." And there it's pretty much bluntly spelled out that there are certain expectations in society. And this is coming from Fareeda, a fellow woman, just saying straightforward to Sarah, like, you can't go to college. Like, that's what men do. And a woman is not a man, which is also the title of this book. And if you think these expectations are simply limited to men, no. What Etaf Rum does really well in this story is show that there are stressful expectations for men as well. Like women, like there are expectations that make them feel terrible and make them feel limited. But for men, like there's a box placed around them too, especially if they're the oldest child, which we see for Adam in this story. There's another quote that I would like to read to you from this. She could see Adam's face redden. "I'd love to help," he said, putting down his spoon, "but I barely have enough time to run Father's store. Between paying the bills and taking care of the family," he stopped, looking over to Isra, "I never see my own family. I'm always working." And there you have Adam kind of outlining a concern that he has, that he's expected to help his other brothers open up stores in the city, in Brooklyn and in New York City in general. And he tells his mother, like, "Oh, I can't take care of my family and also help do these other responsibilities." Like that's a very good concern on part of Adam. And unfortunately, Fareeda and her father and his siblings end up not accepting that. They're like, "You have to help out here." And that makes for Adam even angrier, and what leads to him, at least from my perspective, it leads to him beating Isra, which is unexcusable. But you see that these expectations for men like prevent them from actually helping their family. That like even in Palestine, this might have been a problem, because like men would still have the expectations to provide for their farming fathers, or if they're the oldest ones, to provide for their youngest brothers, to guide them on the path of righteousness or something like that. So Etaf Rum is really highlighting that these expectations in Palestinian society and in Arabic and Muslim society disadvantage everyone involved. Conservative, oppressive society in general disadvantages everyone. And it's important to reflect and say, oh, this is the problem. But as as Fareeda points out, they don't really acknowledge the problem at hand. Like Fareeda cites a jinn as the problem, and others blame the women whenever they don't do something right. So if you're constantly looking at like women, if you're scapegoating women or American society, or if you're scapegoating the supernatural, you're never gonna look inward. You're never gonna honestly question, like, do our rules that society have, like, do the way that we treat women, like, does our own religion force us to or our own extremist religion, the extremist part of the religion, like, does that force us to treat individuals this way and lead to the problems that we're noticing in society? And it's much easier just to scapegoat Jen than to ask these hard questions. And then another thing that Rum talks about here is like the Arab culture over generations, how things change and maybe sometimes also become more progressive. You can see this in like Fareeda versus Isra and Sarah versus Deya, where Fareeda was given many expectations first living in Palestine before moving to America, and she could claim some autonomy in some sense. Like, she noticed that her husband was drinking, so she slapped him and said, that's not going to happen, or I'm going to expose you and that's going to damage your reputation. And that seemed to grant her some more power. But not enough. Like, she still had to serve in a role and prepare her daughters for marriage. But Isra and Sarah feel a bit different, because both Isra and Sarah want to go to college, or at least Sarah wants to go to college. And Isra just wants like less responsibilities and the ability to change like how her children's lives are going to turn out. Like, she confronts Adam several times and says, I fear for our daughters. I wish we could make some changes. And Adam abuses her as a result of that, because he believes that she's going against his word or questioning his authority. But they're both questioning and trying to change the system in which they're in. And then there's Deya, who attempts to subvert the system entirely by just choosing not to get married right away. Like, she might do it down the road, but ultimately she wants to go to college. And she wants to have a career. And she doesn't want to be the one to take care of the kids all by herself. Like, she wants someone to help with that responsibility. And so you see progressive changes to this culture over time. But the cultures stop at a certain point. Like, you might live in America now, where there's more freedom, but men still seek to control, as you see what happens with Adam trying to control Isra as much as possible. And you also see like Nasser in this story, who is trying to court Deya, and he's like, oh yeah, I would let you go to college and maybe have a career, but once we start a family, you're going to raise those children. Like, that's your responsibility. I am going to be the one who has the most authority in this relationship. So ultimately, while it does become more progressive, because this culture dictates that men are in charge, because it's a patriarchal society, you're not going to be able to fully escape that sense of man's control over generations, which I think is what Etaf Rum is especially trying to point to. Like, things may have changed, but ultimately it's the same culture, so it's not going to drastically change in a remarkably notable kind of way. And there's the question, like, would this happen in Palestine as well? Like, because multiple people in the story say, like, oh, American society has changed our girls. If we lived in Palestine, things would be different. And I kind of agree with that. Like, if they were in Palestine, you'd be able to have more control. But also, Fareeda was seeking equality in her relationship in her youth. And so I think over generations, this would happen. And you would see pushback by men, and it might be even easier because you're in a society that allows for that. But women are always going to seek to make changes. It's only because you're in American society where things are a tiny bit freer that this is more predominant than usual. So a lot of good discussion about how you can be more progressive over time, but unless you completely change the culture that you're in, it might not, that progressiveness might not stick, or there's still going to be some hangups there. I also like a couple other things that that Rum does in this story, using America as a backdrop, because she might say like, oh, Palestinian culture is oppressive towards women, but as the character says, like, women don't have that much freedom in American society either. Sure, they may be free to go where they want, and they don't have to get married, but an unmarried woman is still seen as a negative in American society. Like, a woman doesn't have worth unless she has children often, especially with like evangelicals trying to control power in America. We see like anti-abortion activists trying to get their way, and Republicans trying to grasp all control they can over women. So like, I think what Rum might be getting at, or what is hidden in there that might not be fully acknowledged, is that Palestine isn't alone in this. Many cultures all across the world seek to control women, and this is a massive problem, not just in Palestinian society, but everywhere. And it's something that needs to be worked on if there's going to be true equality in terms of gender. Rum also talks about love as well as bravery and choice. Does some really interesting work there in terms of talking about how brave it is to confront your culture and say this isn't right, and to face these issues head on. Because if you avoid it, if you run away as Sarah did in the story, then it's gonna backfire. Like, you're not gonna address the problem. You're only gonna fix things for yourself, and even then, like, there's gonna be something missing because you ran away from your family. And that might not be true in every case, but it is true in situations like this. But there are also a couple issues with this book. Maybe because it's Rum's first story that she wrote. The ending is especially unusual. It seems like Rum wants to have her cake and eat it too. Like, she's saying that like Isra died and by Adam's hands, and then he killed himself. But she also wants to make it seem optimistic for Isra, because at the end of the story, Isra decides to leave Adam during the middle of the day while he's not there, and takes a train and presumably tries to leave Brooklyn, the Bay Ridge area that she's in. So seemingly optimistic, but we know that Isra dies, so something happens in between, like when she dies and when she leaves. So does she return to Adam, or does Adam find her? It's a bit unclear, but the ending is a bit unusual because, again, like, it seems like Rum is trying to have her cake and eat it too, and you could have just ended it without it being like weirdly optimistic in a way. And then another issue is that Rum seems to have an issue with repeatedly spelling out her message, just straight up telling you what it is. Usually authors, like competent authors, like they write a story and they gently put in the message there a couple times throughout the story. But here, Rum is constantly battering you over the head with the message of feminism and gender inequality in Palestinian society. Like, I understood it the first time she put it into the story. I was like, yes, I get what this story is about. But she says it like every 5 minutes. Like, she's constantly have characters saying like Palestinian society isn't very fair towards women. And it's like, okay, I got it the first time you're saying it. Why are you repeating it over and over? Do you not trust your readers to understand exactly what you're saying? And I do get that sometimes your message needs to be overt, or are carefully crafted so as to not, fly over people's heads, especially when it's a message of equality or something like that. But here, it kind of bogs down the story because she's repeating it over and over and over again, and it really feels like she doesn't trust me to pick up this message. And so, like, it seems like she's derailing the story just to repeat this message, which is unfortunate. Anyway, those are my thoughts on A Woman Is No Man by Etaf Rum. A pretty solid story. Despite its glaring issues at times, I do think it's a very powerful and emotional book. One that I think is worth reading. I don't think everyone's going to connect with this book. Even I felt like at times I wasn't necessarily connecting with it, but I still do think it's good. It's a good experience having read this book, and I'm really happy that I read it it for book club, and I can't wait to discuss, my thoughts even further with Bevan and the gang. So yeah, I think I'm gonna recommend it, although with the caveat that like it is rough to read at times, but I do hope that Etaf Rum writes even more, because I would love to see where she goes in the future with these kind of ideas and themes. If you read this before, you simply want to comment on something I said here, do so below. Let's have a discussion about Palestinian society and this book in Etaf Rum. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this author, as well as this book if they don't already know about it. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and equality travels. Farewell.